Hello, I'm pleased today to be joined by Mikael Behrens. He's a good friend of mine, and he's also an expert birder, has done a lot of work studying ornithology. Mikael lives here in Texas. He splits his time between the coast and the Central Texas area here in Austin. He runs Birding on Broadmead, which he started, has done a lot of bird walks and local tours, as well as had extensive involvement in doing bird counts, data collection, and knows a lot about nature connection from his own personal experiences and some of the other work that he has pursued. So anyway, thank you, Mikael, for joining us, and appreciate your time. And can you tell us a little bit more about your own background and how you got into birding?
Sure. Thanks for the invitation to be on the podcast. So way back in the early 90s, I went to the University of Texas at Austin here. I ended up getting a computer science degree, but along the way, I developed an interest in nature and zoology, I guess. I ended up taking a biology course as a science sequence, part of my degree, and ornithology sounded interesting after the intro biology courses, and ended up taking a zoology course per semester for sort of the second half of my college career there, and learned a lot. And somewhere along the way also, while I was in college, I came across Tom Brown Jr.'s book, The Tracker, and that captured my imagination, and was introduced to those ideas through that book. And since then, birds have kind of stuck with me the most over the years. I think that's not very unusual, I think, with birds, because birds occupy this sweet spot of accessibility. They're easy to see and hear. They're beautiful. Most people think they look and sound beautiful. There's a variety of them. There's this just a right amount of variety of them that is challenging to learn them all, but usually not so challenging as to be too intimidating to most people, and you can really see things that birds are doing. They're so accessible, since one of the reasons they're so easy to see is because they have this easy escape route. They can fly, so that's one of the reasons you can just walk outside your door and see and hear a half dozen species of birds, but you don't see any reptiles, or you don't see any mammals or amphibians. So for that reason, I think birds have developed the biggest human community around them that's interested in them than other kinds of animals. And it is, I guess, the same with me.
So yeah, it's I hadn't really thought of it quite from that perspective, although I've heard John Young say some similar things. But so you're saying it's a great gateway if you're, not really a nature-oriented person, or maybe you grew up in a city and never paid much attention. I mean, I found this to be true just thinking back on it. It really is an easy way to drop in.
Yes, yeah, and we have so many resources related to them as well. That's the very first modern field guide, I guess, was a bird field guide made by Roger Torrey Peterson, and we've just been building upon that for decades. And now we have technology coming into the picture with eBird and assistant apps, to help you learn birds. And so it's just really it's, like I said, yeah, it's one of the more accessible areas, and it's but there's still a lot under the initial surface to dig into and challenge you and form, like you said, a strong nature connection.
So just curious about this, and people I talk with and been on this podcast and just in general, who have an affinity for the things we're talking about, and connection to nature, et cetera, it always seems to fall into two buckets. Maybe there's a middle ground too, but it's people who grew up very close to nature, ranch kid, farm kid, what have you, or maybe just personal interest. Or it's somebody who really didn't grow up at all, and then they had an aha moment, took a class like you're saying, and they seem to end up oftentimes in the same place. But your situation, when you were a kid, nature, were you around it much? Did your parents, try to get you interested in it and it just didn't take, or just didn't really have the opportunities?
Um, yeah, it was more, I guess, like the latter description you had. I didn't grow up enjoying nature so much. I had kind of a typical suburban upbringing in the middle class upbringing in the 70s and 80s, I guess. And my parents didn't steer me either direction towards or from nature. And I really didn't, I guess it didn't spark my interest on my own until, like I said, when I went to college and got into it at that point in my life.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And the other reason I wanted to have you on here is because, and I find this very interesting and not very common. You have both a scientific background from studying it, but you also have this nature connection background, which I think is a great mix. On the more science side, if you will, can you talk a little bit about, just how much you've been involved, some of the bird counts you've done, or I know you've done some other data collection projects with other species as well besides birds, but can you just describe those experiences and, how did they benefit you? Were they valuable and ultimately help, facilitate, where you are today and stoked your interest?
Yeah, well, I've never really been a scientist conducting experiments or anything, but I've always seen the value of collecting data. And I've read about the benefits of journaling and keeping records for yourself, but I was always I was never all that motivated to keep records if I knew they were just going to sit on my bookshelf, and just maybe I would go look at them again, maybe I wouldn't. So I got I was initially interested in citizen science projects where the data I would collect would be contributed to a central source and used, and I guess the first one of those types of things are the Christmas bird counts that the National Audubon Society organizes all over the world. I think they're the oldest now known citizen science project, over 100 years old. And they're still very important. They're still going strong. And then when Cornell Lab of Ornithology released eBird, I got really interested in that because all of a sudden I could go out like it was a Christmas bird count every time I went birding, keep a list of all the species and how many of each one of those I found, and it would be contributed to a worldwide central database that that I had access to, not only my observations, but summaries of everyone's observations. And eBird enabled things like, hey, years ago, our local Travis Audubon Society in Austin came up with this little seasonality chart of what birds to expect when during the year, and this was painstakingly compiled by hand based on bird observations over decades, I guess in the 70s and 80s, and then eBird comes along, and all of a sudden you get these types of things automatically, and you can pull them up for different counties all over the state and different states, and things, and so that really made me value the idea of keeping the records like that. Plus, the other thing eBird does, which wasn't so much a factor with me, is a lot of people get into birding as kind of the collector's attraction, where kind of a collector's mentality of they want to build up their life list of species they've seen.
The
And
big year, right?
sorry, big year.
Big year.
Well, there's all kinds of different, flavors of it. There's, the big year that that book and the movie made famous, but birders get into, their total life list of all the species they've seen in their life. How many species have I seen this year? How many species have I seen in my county this year? How many species have I seen from my yard? There's some crazy, mostly retired birders that have the time to do this in Texas called somebody came up with something called this Texas Century Club, where the goal is to observe 100 species of birds in 100 different counties in Texas, and I don't think I have I'm not that patient with driving, and I don't want to leave that big of a carbon footprint, but that it just goes to show you, there's a lot of that kind of drive in the birding world as well. And eBird really served that because it organizes all your lists, and it you can keep your list on paper and submit it on their website, or now they have an app that makes it easy to keep your list in the field, and it already knows where you are and what time of the year it is and what county you're in, and puts that all in the right place in their database, so that not only are you contributing to this worldwide knowledge and database of bird frequency, but it's also feeding this organizational desire that a lot of birders have to maintain all these different kinds of lists.
Yeah, so I'm not going to ask you like how big your life list is. I don't actually have one. If I did, it would embarrass me. But I know you've been doing this a long time. But do you have one or maybe two, but let's just say one, really just experience it kind of mind blowing in terms of seeing a species or something you didn't expect? Is there anything that comes to mind, that you look back on and go, wow, that was it. It's hard to top that moment.
Not just one or two that stand out, but there was this period after I bought a house here in Austin in 2004. And I hadn't been looking around for a really bird friendly area. But I kind of got lucky and bought a house in the neighborhood that was a good bird friendly area. And I started intensely birding my neighborhood once I was discovering this, because I was excited about finding, more birds than I expected in my neighborhood. And eventually I started to find rarities, like a lazuli bunting, just a brief glance, or a yellow-headed blackbird, and it made kind of a subconscious or irrational impression on me, that because up until that point in my birding, I knew these birds were possible, that these birds, pass through during migration. Occasionally they could be found here, but I had never found them. I would read reports of other people that had found them, maybe occasionally go try to find a rare bird that someone else had found and reported somewhere. But until I started intensely birding, my home patch, and finding these birds myself, that's when it finally sunk into my consciousness more, that what diversity was all around us, and what I'm occasionally seeing these things, and how many things am I missing, and so that kind of changed my perception of reality a little bit, and changed my mentality enough. So it wasn't just one or two experience, but it was just that time period of 2005 to 7, or somewhere in there, or 2005 to 2008 maybe, that I kind of cleaned up all my hobbies and kind of shook things up and just pared things down and started intensely birding more, and was able to experience that sort of shift.
Wow, that's awesome. And I think if I remember correctly, at some point in that time frame or thereafter is when you started leading bird walks, right? And during some tours at local preserves, and which I find is great because you know a lot, but it's also just great to be out with other people and get to share your knowledge and learn together. So, do you have any comments about that in terms of, you know, those experiences and what leading those walks are like, and both for you and the people on them?
Yeah, so that came from the same kind of, my kind of evoked my sense of wonder at all these birds I was finding in my neighborhood. And I didn't have to travel to some exotic location or anything. These birds were appearing here, just where I already was, and I wanted more neighbors to know about this. I had encountered like one other birding couple in the neighborhood, walking by with binoculars, that I went and said, hey, met them, and so through the neighborhood association, I started leading a monthly bird walk on in an area of playing fields that eventually became Lake Creek Trail in Northwest Austin and Williamson County. The county eventually built a sidewalk trail that goes along Lake Creek, which is a little creek that doesn't go dry anymore because it's fed by a wastewater treatment plant on the other side of the highway. And despite that, the creek is always full of fish and turtles. And there's
Yeah, it's nutrient rich, right?
Right, yeah.
I've been on these walks with you, and it's amazing how many shorebirds you get, and who come, because it's always got food for them, it seems like.
Yeah, and it not only has some shorebird habitat, which is seems to be mostly used during drought conditions, when the shorebirds can't find other bigger patches of habitat, but there's also patches of riparian woods with some dense undergrowth, that type of thing people don't like to leave in their yards, but that's a whole nother category of habitat with different species of birds that enjoy that. There's then the playing fields themselves, is can be a more open type of habitat. There's open sky available. So it's been so those bird walks eventually grew, and they kind of grew into by word of mouth. They became less of a neighborhood thing and more of sort of an existing birder thing, where I was still getting a few people from the neighborhood, but some, there were some people. There was a retired couple that would drive up from Wimberley to Northwest Austin to go to my bird walk, and that was a really good experience for me. I think it was a good experience for the people on the walks because it was a popular walk, and I always got good feedback. But it was also sort of the next phase in learning for me too. One thing, when I started using eBird, that made me a better birder because it made me look at every bird. It made me optimize identification, and really kind of embrace the idea of, hey, you don't necessarily have to look at a bird through binoculars to identify it. You can see a lot with your naked eye. You can hear a lot. And so that developed, that overall ID skill. And then leading the bird walks kind of shook that up, because, that sort of learning was kind of going towards the more just the Gestalt type of identification, where you take all of everything in at once, and your brain identifies it. First, kind of the first stage in identifying birds is learning a list of field marks to go through, and then you do that enough, and then after a while your brain just recognizes the whole bird by itself. It wants, sort of like we recognize our faces, each other's faces. When you get into that and you start to forget the field marks. And so then leading the bird walks, people would ask, well, how do you know it's that? It makes you kind of relearn, see how they're seeing the bird again, kind of brings those two, identification skills together again, refreshes the other one. And it kind of makes you confront your ego as well, because there's this little voice, well, how do you know it's that? I know, I've been birding a long time.
Yeah, my AI algorithm in here, it's like it's calculated this. It can't be wrong. Yeah.
And it keeps you humble because you're wrong sometimes, and you have to be okay with being wrong in front of, a dozen people. And then there's still some times where still happens to me where everybody in the group is looking at a bird, asking me what it is, and I haven't found it yet, So,
well, I can attest, not much gets by, and you're not wrong very often. It's amazing what you see and hear. So,
yeah, so leading those bird walks was very much the kind of the next stage in my own learning. And I think that's kind of a general principle too, is, once you get to some point in learning a subject, you teach it, and that's kind of the next phase.
One of my first jobs, I had to be a trainer, and on a pretty complex software product, and I was so nervous, but that's actually how I learned it, was by training. Yeah. So, what is this? I don't know. Let me go find out. So,
yeah, there's a little bit of pressure there too, when especially if it's your job. Yeah.
Yeah, and they're paying for it. But yeah, no, it is. It's an incredible way of learning. And I know we could kind of go in 50,000 different directions with our remaining time on birding, but I wanted to focus, since we're in May and we're right in the midst of migration, if we could talk about that, because I think it's a great time if someone's new to birding, even if you're not. There's just so much going on to pick up on. So maybe if you don't mind, kind of just describing or explaining, particularly those who haven't done much birding, what migration is, and and why is it important, both from a ecological standpoint and as we're discussing earlier, if you're out there looking for birds and trying to learn, observe, why should we care? Why is it important or interesting?
Yeah. Well, birds, again, going back to the idea of, hey, why are birds so easy to see? They have this easy escape route. They can fly. They're so mobile, not only in short distances, but in long distances. And so somehow migration evolved. And migration is mostly moving from a seasonal movement of birds at a large scale, at a hemispherical, sometimes global scale, where birds are usually moving someplace during the spring that where they breed, where they nest and breed, and then after breeding is over, moving someplace during the fall to spend the winter. And the temperature is linked in with this, that in the birds will come north from, so in the Americas, most migratory birds, they're spending their winters down south in central South America, although for some birds, Texas is south. The winters don't get as cold, it's not winter, it's the seasons are flipped around, or they're in the tropics where really there is it doesn't get very cold very often, and then they go, when the weather is warm enough up north, they'll travel up there to breed. It's a huge expenditure of energy. And you have to wonder, well, why are they doing this? Why did this evolve as a successful strategy? And I don't know for certain. The theory that made sense to me that I learned way back in college was that in the tropical environments like Central, Northern, South America, once birds reach adulthood, life is pretty easy. There's plenty of fruit and things to eat, but nesting success is very low. And I think that's part of the reason you see such extreme sexual selection, sexual dimorphism in tropical birds. You see these amazing, elaborate male birds with long trailing, crazy feathers, and the females are very cryptic, because the females are the ones on the nest, and there's just a lot of nest predation in the tropics. So somehow, birds being so mobile and just random experimentation and variation, evolutionary urges, I guess somehow some species figured out how to breed in another place where it was a little easier, and they would find places in North America and time things so that just as they were arriving to breed, it was getting warmer, and there'd be this huge emergence of insect life, and so those combination of factors, I think, are what kind of led to migration as being something beneficial to these birds, but it's really risky. A lot of little birds that you wouldn't think about actually, when they're migrating north to the breeding grounds, there's pressure to get their fat the first and get your pick of the best breeding grounds, and so they'll cut across stretches of the Gulf of Mexico and hit, and depending on the weather conditions, they'll wait for good conditions. They'll wait for a tailwind, a south wind behind them to take them across. But, weather in Texas is really dynamic in the spring, and you get all these cold fronts coming through, and sometimes the wind turns around on them while they're out there over the Gulf and makes it a much more difficult journey. And a lot of them don't make it, and the ones that are tired. The ones that do make it are tired and want to find the first patch of habitat they can when they hit the coast and rest there. Those difficult conditions on the birds make for some amazing bird watching conditions, just like life-changing bird watching conditions. And
especially if you have a front come through, right? And they call them fallouts, I think. They'll just
right. And I think what we call a fallout these days is nothing like what people used to see like in the 60s and 70s and even before that, but it's still just
because there were more birds then.
Right. Yeah. But it still can be, it's an amazing experience. People come from all over the country to the Texas coast at this time of year to experience this, even from other countries, bird watchers will come to, and there's, birds are just funneling through the Texas coast on their way to spread out over North America and even up into Canada, and there are little birds that make these amazing journeys. A lot of them just maybe go from, Central America, Mexico, up into, Texas and mid, the middle states. But some of them are coming from South America, from like southern South America, and going all the way up to the Arctic, that
they talk about the wildebeest being the largest migration, but it's kind of pales in comparison to the bird migration, doesn't it, in terms of distance and probably overall number. And I can't remember if you told me this or someone else, but I remember someone saying during one of these fallouts, you had a big cold front, that on an oak tree right there on the coast. I think they saw 12 different species of warblers, I think, in one tree, something just incredible. So
Yeah, it's really amazing. And I'm glad I've got to see that, as many times as I have, not a whole lot of times, because if you don't get that wind turning around, if the birds still have that tailwind out of the south, they'll hit the coast and keep going.
yeah.
And the coast can be a pretty boring place. It's just, being at the right place at the right time during those weather conditions that can be this amazing bird observation experience.
I remember
But
one year I was down there, I think doing a wildlife tracking eval or something at Laguna Atascosa with Ocelot Preserve. And one of these fronts kind of unexpected came in. It was right during this time. And I just so wanted, as much as I was interested in tracking, I wanted to just take off and go, because I've never seen one of these, big fallouts. I just wanted to drive the extra hour and go check it out, because I'd heard so
yeah,
many, incredible things about it. So that's
yeah.
really interesting. And I wanted to ask you, please continue on, but I wanted to interject one thing about, really interesting about why birds come up here. And there's different strategies too, right? In terms of, I know there's the scientific term, I can't think of off the top of my head, but success strategies about getting earlier versus later. Like you said earlier, you get to, your territory first, you have more food, but there's more danger, right? Because of the cold weather in particular.
Right. They're not, there's no guarantees that, the earlier they get there still might be a freeze, that comes in
So
and
even within the same species, they'll adopt different strategies in terms of, when they get there. There may be some individuals get there sooner rather than later.
probably. I hadn't thought about that so much, but that reminds me that even within one species of birds, there are different populations that migrate and don't migrate. So, like in Austin, we have turkey vultures, and some of our turkey vultures are here year round. But turkey vultures are migrating too. And this time of year, if you look up in the sky and you see, 20, 30 turkey vultures drifting south, those are not our year-round resident turkey vultures. Those are migratory ones, that have been coming from the northern states and are just passing through. It's same species, different populations and strategies, I guess. It's pretty
Yeah,
amazing.
I think I remember reading something recent last year or two about monarchs even do that. I think there's a population that doesn't make it all the way down to Mexico, just stays in Arizona.
Yeah,
Yeah, so it's fascinating. But anyway, other species, different species will adopt different strategies then, right? And I guess obviously find the one that works the best for them, or the ones who are most successful will continue reproducing.
yeah. And one of the neat things about migration is that it's not a physical trait. It's a behavior that has a potential to change much more rapidly than, an actual physical trait. So, it's that
So like
you can
adapting to
see,
the climate changing, right? Potentially.
right? Yeah, potentially, yeah.
Hmm.
Um, and also just taking advantage of different habitat types as pressure develops,
Hmm.
you probably heard about white-winged doves. You used to have to go down to the Rio Grande Valley to see a white-winged dove 60, 70 years ago, or 50 years ago even. And now they're the most numerous bird in my North
Yeah,
Austin neighborhood,
same
because
here.
they were experiencing habitat loss down in the Rio Grande Valley,
Hmm.
and they figured out the trick to living in neighborhoods and stopped migrating and started just expanding their range northward in neighborhoods.
Hmm.
Uh, and that worked out really well for them.
Yeah, there's another thing too, which I wanted to ask you about. And I take my daughter out there. My son's too young, but try to watch the migration. In fact, last week we just saw this huge number of seagulls passing through. I think it was the laughing gull, if I remember correctly, and a lot of other species as well. But it seems to be, different every year to some extent. And I know there's the different flyways, and you talk about that. But do those alternate based on conditions and weather, or, you know, and or timings from year to year, or is it pretty much the same every year?
Oh gosh, you know, the concentrations just depend on the weather conditions. Like when I say concentrations, you know, when you run into a group of birds, like a high diversity group of birds during migration, that's just dependent on, hey, those birds encountered some difficult weather conditions, and so they're stacking up and waiting out a storm or something in a patch of habitat. But you know, a lot of the timing doesn't change very much. A lot of different species very consistently show up in different time periods in different places every year. And that's where you can look at those eBird bar charts of seasonality and see, you know, when people see the first ruby crowned kinglet, you know, in the fall, you know, or when people see the first or hear the first Acadian flycatcher in the spring, you know, a lot of those species very consistently, the first ones show up at in the same narrow date ranges. It's really interesting. And you mentioned the laughing gulls; those were actually Franklin's gulls.
Yeah, I'm sorry, that's right.
Yeah.
They were Franklin.
Yeah.
That's right.
And the laughing gulls are the resident year-round coastal species.
Yeah.
Franklin's gulls are one of those long-distance migrants that winters in the west coast of South America and breeds up in like the northern states and Canada, in the inland lakes and stuff. And there's nothing like, you know, walking around in Austin and all of a sudden you hear seagulls.
Yeah.
And you look up and you
I mean,
see
we
a
saw
big
several
flock of
hundred of
them.
Yeah, it was incredible.
You feel like you're on the coast.
Yeah, and it was interesting. Some of the other, well, this gets in a little bird language, but some of the other ones were some of the other birds on the ground. It's interesting watching their reactions, and you could tell that they were cautious. They changed their behavior, and the other birds I think caused that too. But it's just interesting observing the whole spectacle, you know, both from just the magnificence of it as well as just how it changes everything. And actually, you brought up something I wanted to ask you about. You know, besides, I think to the kind of novice, and this is the way I thought of it, that the difference between spring and fall migration just kind of in reverse. Is that true, or it's actually more nuanced that? And how do they kind of interface? You know, the same birds that, you know, come first, you know, leave last, or do they leave first? How does that work? Is there any rhyme or reason to that?
There's sort of general tendencies that spring migration is more urgent and it's more concentrated in a shorter period of time, you know.
Okay.
Whereas because there's that advantage to getting to the breeding ground sooner, and taking advantage of the time to reproduce, a very important thing birds have to do. Fall migration, they're done breeding. Some birds then will take that opportunity to molt, to replace a lot of their feathers. And then heading south is more laid back. It's more spread out over time. The birds can be a little more cryptic, a little more harder to see. They're just passing through a little more slowly on their way to get to the, you know, their wintering grounds. So that's kind of the general idea.
They don't have to take as many risks, right? Because again, the urgency is not there. So,
right.
Okay, interesting. Yeah. One of the things I find interesting too is, you know, a lot of people, when I first started tuning into this, very interested in, you know, songbirds, and which they are, and there's so many varieties and they're beautiful. But as I got more and more into bird language and then started teaching it, I became fascinated by the raptor migration. And I noticed, particularly where we live, in fact, I just finished a semester teaching bird language at the University of Florida. And here, in Texas, our raptor population, I don't have the numbers, and you might, but it just seems like it explodes, particularly among accipiters, numbers of Cooper's hawks in this area. And so from a bird language perspective, I find it a really interesting time because in many respects, the resident birds here, and I'm sure the ones that are migrating through, it becomes a very dangerous time because the density, of these bird killers, these accipiters who are specialists in hunting birds as well as other hawks, goes way up. And so I actually really enjoy when the fall migration is finished, because even though a lot of people think it's kind of a downtime of year for birding, at least here it picks up. Now, that's not true up north. In fact, I had a student point out, he was taking the class remotely in Massachusetts. And he's like, well, most of our raptors left. So a lot of these
Right,
things
yeah.
I'm starting to see now, right? You can't please everybody. But anyway, that was a real eye opener when I started, observing that. And,
Yeah, and that kind of links into the changing of priorities in birds' lives throughout the year, where in the wintertime and here in Texas, I mentioned before, we're north for some birds, we're south for some birds. So we don't have, and then we have year-round birds too. So all winter long, we have our year-round birds, and we have a group of winter resident birds, which includes some of the predators like you're talking about, like sharp-shinned hawks, more Cooper's hawks, 3 kinds of falcons. And so their prey, there's these little songbirds grouped together in these mixed species foraging flocks and are watching for these predators and making call notes to each other across species and making alarm calls to each other across species. And that's really I love birding in the winter for that reason, because, everything can be just dead in the woods, and then you'll hear some really soft contact calls, and then your path crosses with one of these mixed foraging flocks moving around in the woods. And all of a sudden, there's 6 or 8 species of birds, and it's really a lot of fun. Yeah,
it's awesome. I mean, I see so many more alarms. I mean, probably like 4 or 5 times as many, even though, the overall bird activity is less, certainly song and, even the feeding, because they're not having to feed young anymore. It's just incredible. I really enjoy it. I know most people kind of think of it as an off time of year, but I don't look at it that way.
Yeah, me neither. And like you said, it's a different story in some of the northern states in Canada. But another things are kind of changing in the summer, in the spring and the summer here. And just in the last less than 10 years, more hawks are using neighborhoods in Austin. And I've read that it's a more general phenomenon as well. Maybe enough time has gone by finally where, hawks, it used to be for a long time, hawks saw a person, that person wanted to shoot it, and maybe that's shifted enough that now, just in the past less than 10 years, there are more Cooper's hawks here in the summer nesting in neighborhoods here. There are broad-winged hawks, one of the spectacularly migratory species of hawks, that nested in my front yard a couple years ago. And now there are also Mississippi kites nesting in neighborhoods all over town. They're around my yard every day, the past month or so since they started arriving again. And so it's something new that's happening. And I'm hopeful. Neighborhoods are one of those, habitat types that's actually growing. And if we could get enough people to appreciate that and make some tweaks to make them even more, attractive to birds, and maybe try to convince more people that, your homogeneous lawn isn't the most beautiful, aesthetically pleasing thing in the world, that let's have some undergrowth in your yard, more native plant species and stuff. There's a lot of I think there's a lot of hope for neighborhoods as a habitat type for birds and other wildlife.
This is just kind of a side note, but my neighbors may not like me for this, although I've got a fence around my property. But yeah, I let my yard kind of go feral this year, and intentionally let native grass move in over the last several years, and I've got pretty deep topsoil. But it's amazing, just not, I don't know about so much increase in bird activity, but insects. But I've got just a tremendous amount of fireflies. And we have had a lot of rain this spring so far, but it's amazing when you do a few things like that, you can create better habitat, which benefits everybody. And of course, on the other hand, I totally agree with you. In fact, when I was a kid in my parents' small town, a couple hours west of here, I mean, we hardly ever saw red-shouldered hawks in town, and now they're all
Yeah.
over the place,
Yeah, they're a year-round resident.
Yeah. Yeah, I feel, but usually, like you said, they were skittish. They seem to be much more skittish. I mean, I don't have the actual data, but I'm pretty sure of that. I feel sorry for the poor songbirds because obviously they take a hit. And some of my students would be saying, "Oh, I saw a couple of hawks or even kites, and I noticed songbirds got quiet," and they're like, "But I think it might have been because the neighbor's dog started barking." I'm like, "Well, I don't know about that. These guys are killers, it probably has more to do with
Yeah.
that."
Yeah, I have a neighbor who has a couple photos of Mississippi kite carrying a purple martin in its
Yeah,
talons. But
I had a student do exactly. She goes, "I saw two. I think they were was it longtail kites?" And was saying, "Oh, I think it was a lawnmower." And I'm like, "Man, those things are incredibly maneuverable." As I've watched them actually, Mississippi kites catch dragonflies, which, I mean, that's an
yeah.
extraordinary feat of athleticism. So I can only imagine how birds view that. And actually, I think that's a good segue into this whole aspect of your own journey, if you don't mind talking about it, how getting into birding and migration and things we've been talking about, and bird language has facilitated, your own nature connection, and the way you view nature and your relation to it, if you can comment on that.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the obvious thing is that just all these other aspects that come into play make everything more engaging, more immersive. It's when you start to realize the seasonality of birds, and their different priorities through the year, and you start to observe that, and see the ramifications of that in the bird's actions and reactions. That's just satisfying. It connects you with that aspect of nature more directly than you had before. And that makes me think about, getting into birding by ear more and more too, is bringing another sense into play, makes it that much more engaging and immersive. And as you when you get to a level where you can see a lot of these things happening, you can go outside for a very short period of time and see something satisfying and meaningful, or observe, some reaction to birds, which just makes life easier to deal with. It's like there's this inherent desire in most people. Some people think all people, to have this connection with nature, and there's kind of a lack of understanding of how to make that connection. And John Graves wrote a book called Goodbye to a River.
Yeah.
I think it was about the Brazos River. Yeah. At the time in the 50s when he wrote the book, there were plans to dam it, and he had spent a lot of his childhood there, and he made a like a month-long camping trip on it via canoe down the river, and he wrote about it. And he really captured well. He has this quote that describes, there's this desire to have nature as this important factor in our lives, but our number one priority always has to be the layer of existence we've built on top of that. He calls it like a prickly machine humming world that we've built on top of nature, and that has to be our number one priority. You have to pay your rent, you have to deal with get your driver's license renewed, all this, do your job, all these multitudinous things, so that appreciation of nature and learning about it and studying it has to take a lower priority. But I think birds really optimize that lower priority place, in our lives. Just because, I've already said how accessible they are. They occupy the sweet spot of being able to see them just about anywhere you are, hear them. And then if you are able to invest the time to get more in tune with them, the seasonality, their priorities throughout the year, you can just, go outside for 5 or 10 minutes in the morning and see something, and take that back with you, and that's really satisfying thing to do. You didn't have to drive anywhere. You didn't have to invest a whole morning or day, hiking somewhere. There's just this accessibility of nature connection that birds make for us in these little snippets of time. Like, I think it was it was last fall, I think. I went out for a few minutes with my cup of coffee before I started work in the morning. And like in my neighbor's backyard behind me, I heard a little a blue-gray gnatcatcher call. And then, and that was to the south. And then to the north, I heard another, and these two blue-gray gnatcatchers came from the north. And this one behind me came up and joined them. And the three of them, continued on their way south. And I thought, had they already been together, had these two been together and this third one hooked up with them, this little right is in that, 30 seconds I was there to see it and experience it. It's cool stuff out there.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, when you were talking about Goodbye to a River, Don Henley wrote a song on that, about the book. And
really, wow.
Yeah, he grew up in North Texas. I think he lives up there again now, his old dad's farm or something. But yeah, it's very Edward Abbey-esque, which
Okay.
Desert Solitaire. I remember when you were talking about that, and I read that.
And John Graves is a little more laid back than Edward.
Yeah. But he was talking about going down the Colorado River right before, I believe, his Glen Canyon Dam was built. And I think those are questions for our time about, we can't go back to Stone Age. Obviously, we're not going to, but how do we not only protect what we have, but how do we engage with it and give it, Aldo Leopold talked about this extensively, give it the value it deserves and participate in it, because I'm of the belief, and you were saying this, I think in a way, it's in our DNA, everybody. And it's good for us. I just literally had a student write me as the semester ended. I always have them they have a final project, and they have to do like a research proposal, and also they have to do kind of a group experiment or a group sit and record those. But then they also have a final reflection, which is really just their time to opine, what they learned. And, in terms of what they pick up on bird language, you can tell most of them are still kind of early stages in what they observe, and that's fine. But the thing that I'm really impressed and really glad is they got across the idea of just the nature connection. And I don't know if it's the right word, but being able to empathize with birds and observe them and understand, not only struggles, but just their life and paying attention to it. And not only is that good, I think, for birds and on the long term of us, having, because I'm firm belief that the more you identify with nature or connect with it, the more you want to protect it. But it's good for us as well. And I had a couple of students, one in particular said that, she was going through some depression, anxiety, and that literally just going out and doing bird sits, it made a profound impact on her,
Yeah, there's a whole area of therapy being developed called ecotherapy.
Yeah.
Last time I was at my doctor, I saw a little flyer on the wall, ask about a nature prescription.
Right. Yeah.
So, have you seen that? Yeah.
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 That sounds like a Bill Murray line. I think
Yeah.
about Bob, a prescription to take a vacation from your problems. But no, it's true. And I think you sent me something about it was on NPR, something about fly fishing and a woman who had chronicled. And so there's a number of different ways. I think birds is, and I know John Young believes this, is one of the very best ways of doing that, because all the reasons you described, the accessibility, the fact we can see them, and just all their behaviors. So, well, with our remaining time, I wanted to just ask you, because you've already alluded to it with eBird, but can you talk about, for people who maybe again are just getting into it, or even if they've been doing this for a while, the best ways of using technology? And technology can even be binoculars, but in this case, probably more talking about, online tools, applications, also the pros and cons of it, when to use it, when not, and what are some of your favorites? I know you mentioned eBird, but what are some of your other favorite tools that you would recommend to people that won't be, I'm big about not being overwhelmed. I just wrote a blog recently about, kind of putting your smartphone down when you're outside, but at the same time, they can be very powerful learning mechanisms. So I think you're a good person to understand the balance between those two. So if you could speak to that.
Sure. Yeah, I love technology.
That's
and
right.
if you said to me, okay, you have a choice. You have to get rid of your binoculars or your iPhone. Which is it going to be? That would be a tough decision for me. So back in 2007, the first iPhone came out, and what finally pushed me over the edge to get one was a product called BirdPod, which was sort of an app before there were even apps. And it was originally made to put on an iPod. And when the iPhone came out, it was also an iPod. And this company had taken a 4 CD set of North American bird sounds and songs, and had figured out how to put it onto an iPod in a way where each bird had its own track, and they skipped over the person announcing each bird. Like, remember those old bird tapes and stuff where even on CD, one track would have like 2 or 3 or 4 birds, and there'd be somebody announcing Northern Cardinal, and then there'd be, there'd be the Cardinal song. So the iPod was revolutionary in a lot of ways. You could navigate through your music so fast, and so so when the iPhone came out, it also had a little built-in speaker, and I could put this BirdPod product on it and have this out in the field with me and hear a bird make some guesses as to what it was on my iPhone, pull it up pretty quickly and compare it to the recordings. And that was a game changer for my birding by ear, and learning bird sounds. So that was, one of the big boosts that technology gave me, even out in the field. And I already talked about eBird making me a better birder and facilitating just the citizen science of collection of data from, worldwide, the whole birding community. As part of my enthusiasm for birding in my neighborhood, when I was doing my bird walks, getting those started, I got into photography with the motivation of documenting, these birds I was finding. And, especially if I built up some skill with the camera, being able to capture identifiable pictures of birds, not only can I share them on a blog, and make neighbors more aware, but I can document rare species that show up, and local, rare bird alert committees will be a lot, more likely to accept a photo than a written description, especially from a birder that doesn't have an established, reputation for identification skill. And now, photography has just gotten better and better. You can get, there's still some monetary investment required, but you can get cameras, and unfortunately your smartphone camera usually doesn't work, but you can get cameras where it's easier and easier with big zooms on them, and it's easier and easier to get at least an identifiable picture of a bird. And some people get into birding that way. They're taking pictures of birds before they know what the birds are, and then they go home and figure out what the bird is.
And that's where tools like Merlin now, obviously both by song and also by photo can help, right? So you don't even have to wait till you get home.
Right. Yeah. If you can feed the picture into the app.
Yeah.
I guess, yeah, some people, you can take a picture of it on the screen on the back of your camera, maybe. But the photography can also, become kind of a burden. I'm kind of been taking a break from it recently for the past year or so, just because it's so easy to go out there and take a bunch of pictures. And then, well, if you want those pictures to contribute to something, to be more data for eBird or more observations for iNaturalist, you have to process them. You have to spend time in front of your computer at home to deal with them and put them in all the places, edit them, put them in all the places you want them to live. And that can be kind of that's been kind of a psychic burden on me in the last recently in the past year or so. So I've been going at a lot just without my camera lately, just to get back to just that enjoyment in the moment too. It can take a little bit of that away if you're more worried about getting a photo of a bird than you are of seeing it and experiencing it yourself. So I talked about eBird before. I mentioned iNaturalist just now. iNaturalist is a really interesting platform that's now it's hosted by the California Academy of Sciences. It's sort of structured like Facebook, but how Facebook has at its center, you have a status update. You tell the world, hey, what's going on, and people who follow you see that and they can comment on it, and people keep in touch with each other that way. Well, iNaturalist has at its basis the nature observation, usually with a photo, but it can also be a sound. And you post these nature observations in a Facebook-like format, and people who follow you or people who follow a certain subset of taxonomy that you posted something in can find it and post comments on it, but also post identifications to it. eBird is just birds. iNaturalist is plants and animals of all kinds all over the world. And so they have this sort of different crowdsourcing technique of once enough people agree on an identification of, my observation, it's considered research grade, and they have you can filter on just research grade observations, and you'll have a little bit more of confidence that, at least some people agree on them, and it won't be as, randomly incorrect as otherwise. And you can also post observations that you don't know what it is yet, and have people, contribute and figure out what things are in that way. And they have various ways of presenting this observational data. You can define geographical places and then see all the observations in that place, organized by, taxonomically, and what's really interesting is that the two platforms have these different mission statements. eBird's mission is about harnessing the birding community to learn more about birds, and learn more about bird distribution, especially. And iNaturalist, if you look up their mission, data collection is part of their mission, but their number one priority is connecting people with nature. And that, that's resulted in their different user interface. They're more of a social network. I've just been realizing the past year or so, talking to more people involved. There's a monthly naturalist happy hour around Austin that a friend of mine organizes, and these a few people have been showing up that aren't really in the birding community. They aren't part of the local master naturalists. They're iNatters. They call them iNaturalist users, iNatters. And they're kind of a different personality type. They want to dive into these details and see as many different things, and catalog them as they can. And they organize what they call these bio blitzes on iNaturalist, where they meet, there'll be a day where a bunch of iNat users meet at some area that maybe doesn't have a whole lot of observations yet, and they just spend a day just going crazy making iNaturalist observations in whatever areas they specialize in, and build up data for that area. So that, those are two big technology platforms that are really contributing in these different, sometimes complementary ways to knowledge and even nature connection as well.
Well, that's great. Thank you. Let's wrap up here. I have a question for you. I think you're maybe the perfect person to answer this. What do you see coming? And with that, I know you could probably talk for 45 minutes on this, but just in, a minute or two, what do you see coming down the pike? I mentioned Merlin earlier. I had students use it. I think it's a really useful tool. It's an app on the iPhone, people out there, and it will identify, does pretty good job depending on the, how well the audio registers, how loud it is, clear it is, identifying a bird, and by pictures as well. Like you said, if you can get a picture into it. But what do you see coming in terms of artificial intelligence? Obviously, that's all over the news right now. And I've been talking to some other people who are doing work on just animal communication and using artificial intelligence. With respect to birding, how do you see that impacting things going forward? And, potentially from a user's perspective, how that could help, if anything?
Well, about the only application of artificial intelligence I'm aware of is, like you say, with Merlin. And a little more background on Merlin. Merlin is a smartphone app developed by Cornell Lab of Ornithology, based on eBird. They're the people behind eBird as well, based on all this eBird data they have. And it started as kind of a modest, just beginner's aid tool for identifying birds, where it would ask you questions about the bird you saw, and it would use the time of year and your location to help you narrow down what bird you saw. Then they added, like, it can try to identify a photo that you put into it of the bird. They added more information like range maps and descriptions and sounds, where you can just play sounds, for each bird. So it grew into its own field guide app that's as good as the other leading field guide apps out there. Oh yeah, one of the things I love about it is the range maps usually don't stop at the Rio Grande Valley.
Yeah,
You
right.
know, people ask you, well, where does that bird go in the winter? Most North American field guides, you don't know. You know, they just show you, well, this is its North American range, but the Merlin range maps will often show you where it goes in the Southern Hemisphere as well. So, you know, a few other apps had tried to start to identify bird sounds, and none of them did a really good job. A friend of mine had one called Song Sleuth that she would bring on bird walks just to make fun of it, you know, because it was wrong so often. So Merlin, they just kind of announced a couple years ago, oh, by the way, we added sound identification, no big deal. And it was better than any other app that had tried it yet. I think it's great. It's a huge help to birding by ear. You know, it's as much as that little bird pod thing helped me, I think Merlin will help people like 10 times more. I've heard concerns of people that I've heard concerns from other birders that they've seen beginning birders or even non-birders just trusting it, you know, implicitly, and arguing with experienced birders, you know, Merlin said it was this. And, you know, there's something implicitly more trust, you know, intuitively more trustworthy when you see it printed on an app, you know. And it's really cool the way it listens, you know, it's in real time, it will display the name of the species that it hears, and it'll keep the list, and it's recording the sound too. You can save the recordings and it will have all the birds that it thinks were on that list. But the best way to use it, I think, is to try to find that bird that it says you're hearing, and verify that it's out there. I even know a birder who's lost a lot of hearing, you know, in his old age, that uses Merlin, that feature of Merlin now, as kind of a substitute for the hearing he lost. And he doesn't trust it, you know, but he knows to maybe look for these birds, you know, that his hearing can't pick up on, but Merlin picked up on it, and he won't put it immediately on his eBird list, but he'll look for those birds and often find them that he wouldn't have seen otherwise, you know.
I've tried to fool it a few times by making some calls and cardinal, and it registers human voice most of the time. I have fooled it
Oh yeah.
on crow calls a few times, which I was kind of proud of. But
oh, cool. Wow.
yeah, that my wife makes fun of me for trying to. But yeah, it'll be interesting to see where all this goes, because a couple of guys I've had some contacts and working with a little bit. George Buman, who's with Yellowstone Institute, and he really is an animal communication expert. He's writing a book, and a colleague of his is using AI to interpret parrot, titmice, and chickadee calls. And I think in the future we'll see these where it not only recognizes calls, but will tell you much more about behavior. You know, maybe what that bird's actually doing potentially, and what this specific call means. And it'll be really interesting to see where that goes, which is exciting. You know, like everything else with technology, can be downsides. And, you know, I could also see, you know, people maybe misusing it, trying to call birds in and, you know, get other birds to come in, which is already happening anyway, as you well know, but I'm sure it'll get more sophisticated. So it will
Yeah.
be interesting to see where all that
Yeah.
goes.
I'm wondering also if maybe AI will take a larger part in data analysis, you know, just the huge volume of data that iNaturalist and eBird both have now. You know, just finding patterns. I don't know.
I'm sure it will. And I
Maybe,
know some of these individuals are already working on that. And
yeah.
they say they're making advances already. So that's definitely coming. Well, Michael, thank you so much. This has been really interesting. You have a lot of insights. If you want to find Michael, he's got a website, Birding on Broadmead. If you're down in the Austin area and he happens to be doing a walk, I highly recommend it. And really appreciate your time and thank you so much.
Thanks. Yeah, I haven't been as active as I've been in previous years, but one of the new things I've been doing is leading a birding by ear workshop for our local Travis Audubon Society whenever I can, on the calendar, a single morning activity. That's been really satisfying, and a lot of people seem to like it. So you can check Travis Audubon's calendar for that if you're in the Austin area. And yeah, thanks, Lee. This has been a lot of fun talking about my favorite stuff.
Well, great. And I look forward to doing some more, especially now pandemic's over, doing some more birding with you, get my kids out there with you. So.
Yeah, sounds great.
Okay. All right. Take care.